This was one of the last great battlefields for the American West, when a handful of Modoc Indian men, women, and children stunned the nation by holding off the power of the U.S. Army.
They were pulling troops in, nearly 1,000, to battle anywhere between 50 and 70 Modoc warriors. And those warriors held them off for almost a year.
The military would spend hundreds of thousands of dollars, all in pursuit of this small band.
This was not a minor skirmish. At the time that it happened in 1872, 1873, it was big news all over the world.
News reports carried the story from New York to London. Captain Jack, Sconchin John, and Hooker Jim became famous.
These were people who were fighting and defending their homelands. History texts until very recent times don't treat it that way.
It's not ancient history. It happened just 2 or 3 generations ago.
And our bloodline is strong. Our people are strong, and we're not going away.
Funding for Oregon Experience is provided by the James F. and Marion L. Miller Foundation, the Oregon Cultural Trust, and viewers like you. Thank you.
In the mid-1800s, the promise of gold and cheap land lured Americans west, and they came by the thousands.
The white travelers were actually passing through people's homelands. They were passing through areas that were already occupied by people. And this is something that usually gets scant notice in the historical literature.
As the frontier expanded, Native Americans and newcomers clashed. Tales of massacres, both real and imagined, alarmed and outraged whites trekking into hostile land. Along the Oregon-California border, Modoc Indians had a fierce reputation.
In 1852, a man known throughout Northern California as the Indian fighter of his time, Ben Wright, made the decision to exterminate as many Modocs as he could find.
By most accounts, Wright had come west to mine gold, but the California legislature would pay him to hunt Indians. After reports that Modocs attacked a wagon train, Wright rallied a posse of miners from Wairika and led the men to Modoc territory.
Northern California, the miners were notoriously ruthless, and they have no scruples about shooting and killing Indians.
There were many Modoc camps in the region. Ben Wright picked one. He said he wanted a peace meeting and rode in under a white flag of truce.
He descended on a Modoc village, and there he killed over 30 men, women, and children, literally hunting them down. They tried to hide in the sagebrush or jumping into the lake.
Only a handful of Indians survived.
When we arrived, Captain Wright advanced with 32 men, mounted and well armed, and killed 30 Indians. The balance got into their canoes and made their escape. Captain Charles McDermott, 1852.
It comes to represent a much larger story about the encounters between settlers and Indians, that it's violent, that it's sort of fraught with political betrayal, that there are agreements that are then broken, and that Indians are oftentimes the victim of the duplicity of settlers.
The whites treated Ben Wright as a hero. The Modoc people would never forget the Ben Wright massacre.
Thank goodness for my mom and my dad and my family, because when I was younger, I didn't have a clue what any of this was.
Modoc descendant Taylor David tracks the tribe's genealogy.
So this is me, Taylor Tupper David. My dad is Rayson Tupper. My mom is Cheryl. So that makes Wynema Toby Riddle my four great grandmother.
Toby Riddle, also known as Wynema, is remembered for her role in the Modoc War with the United States Army. But she was just one of many Modocs living in a time of hardship and change.
These were good, kind, caring people fighting for their way of life, just to live.
Their struggle once had the world enthralled, but many times the stories have been wrong, based on exaggeration and bias. Even first-hand reports and official government records are often full of inaccuracies, and there are few accounts from the Indians themselves.
These were people who were voiceless in the past. They didn't leave documented records. They didn't write their own histories. They didn't tell their own stories.
The first recorded outside contact with the Modocs dates to the 1820s, when fur trappers made their way south from Fort Vancouver. Over the next few decades, more people would come, and they would stay. By 1863, the U.S. government set up a military fort in the region to protect the settlers from the local tribes and to establish a claim to the land. It was called Fort Klamath and was about 60 miles north of the Oregon-California border.
Fort Klamath was bustling. You had a lot of troops in here. They had a hotel here. They had their own theater here, barber shops, blacksmith shops, several blacksmith shops.
At its height, Fort Klamath housed 2,000 men, both Civil War veterans and new recruits.
You have an incredible militarization of the West following the Civil War. It also becomes just basically a place to stick soldiers that you don't have anything to do with. So they have a lot of free time.
Alfred Meacham was the Oregon Superintendent of Indian Affairs. His duties brought him to the fort, where he found some soldiers taking advantage of the nearby Indians, stealing their wives and horses, and spending too much time drinking.
The United States Army is sometimes disgraced by bad men in high office. Fort Klamath was unfortunate in being sometimes under command of officers who dishonored the uniform they wore. Alfred Meacham.
The fort was built in Klamath Indian homeland, but several tribes lived in the region, each made up of small scattered bands. The bands interacted, but lived separately, with their own leaders. In 1864, some of those leaders signed a treaty with the U.S. government, agreeing to give up most of their lands and live together on a reservation.
These were most usually not negotiations between equals. The whole notion was to have Indians sign treaties and to cede large acreages of land to the government of the United States.
The government, busy with the Civil War and later Reconstruction, didn't fully ratify the treaty for years, but it still expected the Indians to give up their lands and move to the new reservation.
So the reservation brings these people together who are now trying to sort things out on a cramped, cold reservation with very few resources and the promise of annuities from the federal government that are slow or late in coming. And so there's tremendous tension there.
The different bands didn't always get along, sometimes harassing or stealing from each other.
The Modocs were ill-treated and abused by the Klamath Indians. The Klamath ceaselessly annoyed them with threats and insults. Alfred Meacham.
In the winter months, many Indians went hungry, forced to kill their horses for food. One of the Modoc leaders, named Kintapus, went to the reservation's government offices to appeal for help. He spoke no English, but other Modocs did, and they translated his concerns to the agent in charge, O.C. Knapp.
3 times he went, and 3 times he was ignored. And on the 3rd time, he said, I may be an Indian, but I am not a dog, and I will not live with this. And he left.
They remained quietly on the reservation until April 26th, when I stopped issuing rations. Since that time, they've been roaming around the country between Lost River and Wairika. O.C. Knapp, 1870.
Kintapus returned to his traditional homelands to find it changed.
But when the Modocs returned, there's simply greater numbers of whites there. Areas are overwhelmed. They're gathering grounds for bulbs and other kinds of foodstuffs off the landscape, hunting game, catching fish, and so forth, are being disrupted in very dramatic ways.
To get by, some Modocs worked as ranch hands, while Kintapus made business arrangements with newcomers, charging rent for use of his lands. He also found work in nearby Wairika, where he was known as Captain Jack.
He was then a man of 30 years of age, a man of square mold, 5 feet 10 inches in height, a royal-blooded man of more than common heritage, Alfred Meacham.
Captain Jack was a leader of a small band of Modocs that included several members of his family. Scarface Charlie was Jack's right-hand man. Scanchin John was said to be rival for leadership and one of the few survivors of Ben Wright's attack. John's brother, Old Scanchin, signed the Treaty of 1864 and was an important leader within the Modoc tribe. Once he had fought the whites, but now he lived in peace.
I thought if we killed all the white men we saw, that no more would come. We killed all we could, but they came more and more, like the new grass in spring. My heart was sick. I threw down my gun. I said, I will not fight again. I made friends with the white man. Old Scanchin, Modoc chief.
Old Scanchin's followers would remain on the reservation, but they would not stop Captain Jack's band from leaving.
They were free to come and go as they pleased, as long as they didn't cause any problems. But settlers decided they wanted that land worse than the Modocs, and it was all over land anyway. They wanted them out. They complained that the Modocs were causing problems.
Many of the complaints amounted to trespassing and petty theft.
The Indians are becoming more insolent every day. When they want a barrel of flour or beef, they go and demand it from the nearest settler. A dozen or more would go into a house and demand supper, then sit and smoke by the fire. Indian Agent Thomas O'Donnell.
By the fall of 1872, local Indian agent Thomas O'Donnell was determined to move the Indians back to the reservation. He finally got government approval to use whatever force necessary to return the Modocs.
You are hereby directed to remove the Modoc Indians to the Klamath Reservation, peaceably if you possibly can, but forcibly if you must.
O'Donnell called in the military. About 35 members of the 1st Cavalry stationed at Fort Klamath headed south to the Modoc homelands. They passed through the town of Linkville, later to become Klamath Falls. There, locals joined in the hunt.
They arrived in Lost River country. It was terribly, terribly cold. Many of them were even frozen to the saddle. But they arrived down there just at dawn.
The military failed to warn the Modocs or the nearby settlers. Captain Jack was asleep in his tule hut when the soldiers rode in.
Scarface Charlie was the first Modoc to see these blue-clad soldiers, and you can imagine what must have been his astonishment.
Jack thought they had come to talk. He stayed in his hut, expecting the officers to join him, as they had in the past. Instead, the soldiers tried to arrest the Modocs and demanded their weapons. Scarface Charlie held his ground.
Scarface Charlie and a Lieutenant Botel faced each other. They both drew their weapons. They both fired. And they both missed.
Both sides began shooting. And suddenly, unexpectedly, a war was on.
The Lost River battle, which happened as a result, should never have happened. It was not government authorized. It was a total disaster. A disaster for the Army and eventually for the Modocs, too.
Captain Jack's people ran for their canoes, making their way south to the safety of an ancient lava flow. Meanwhile, civilians fired on another separate Modoc camp, led by Hooker Jim. Reports of the dead varied. At least one Modoc warrior, a woman and a child were killed, possibly more.
The militia, the volunteers, are undisciplined. You know, they have no sense of what they're doing except they want to kill the people they're after.
Hooker Jim and his men went on a rampage, killing more than a dozen settlers in the area.
One settler got her boy into the cabin along with a younger son, and she said, "Fire at will." She took her home, and with bags of flour, she made it into a fort. And she and her children held off the Modocs. And it was 3 days before anybody came to their rescue. A very brave woman.
When it was all over, Hooker Jim's band joined up with Captain Jack in the lava fields. Soon, other Modocs began arriving, and Jack had a small but determined fighting force, many in their teens and early 20s. In all, about 55 men and their families. This was Jack's stronghold. Today, it's part of the Lava Beds National Monument. Just beyond the Oregon border into California, the lava fields spread over 47,000 acres. They hold more than 700 caves. It has been a sacred site to the Modoc people from time immemorial.
To me, any step I take down here, I'm stepping on something that's spiritually sacred ground.
The Modocs knew this area as the land of burnt-out fires. It was formed by volcanic eruptions that date back nearly 500,000 years. People have lived here for at least 11,000 years. And the Modocs believe this land was created for them.
Our Creator told us that we'd be small in number but mighty warriors. He put us here and he said, you're my chosen people. So we know who we are. We're the chosen ones. The good-looking ones too, isn't it?
Lynn Sconchin's ancestors, John and Peter, fought here during the Modoc War.
When I first come down, like I said, I was curious how they got through here. Pretty smart people.
The Modocs knew the land and its secrets. The lake provided a nearby water supply. Lava tubes made natural trenches. They further fortified the area with rock walls. And caves provided shelter. Today, researchers are still discovering exactly where and how the Modocs lived here. Modoc descendant Devery Saluskin is an archaeological technician with the Lava Beds National Monument.
So John Sconchin would have been in here, asleep. Maybe his son Peter would have been in here with them. It wasn't just men fighting against men. It was an army against families.
My great-grandfather, Shack Nasty Jim, his wife Anna was pregnant during the war, and that child was literally born, in the stronghold. It must have been a terrible burden to be bearing.
From Salem, Oregon Governor Lafayette Grover ordered the Modocs arrested and called up a volunteer militia to protect the settlers. Meanwhile, the military prepared for a short wintertime operation. Reinforcements arrived from Fort Vancouver. And finally, in January of 1873, over 300 men were ready for battle, outnumbering the Modoc warriors 6-1.
The soldiers were confident about taking the Modocs by the end of the day, unbelievably confident. They didn't even think there was going to be much of a battle. But certainly they got the surprise of their lives.
But not everyone was in favor of war. Religious and humanitarian groups were concerned about the nation's Indian policy. After his election in 1868, President Ulysses S. Grant promised them a policy of peace.
He's receiving guests and visitors, and they're coming in. They all have ideas, and Apparently a delegation of Quakers comes into his hotel room and they say, what will be your Indian policy? And he says something along the lines of, it will be a Quaker policy. It will be a peace policy. The peace policy is not really a true peace policy. It's not like they're actually out for peace. It's peace by the conditions we set, or prepare for total war.
The peace policy was predicated on the notion of the Army rounding up and placing all peoples on reservations. It was a full front assault on Indian culture.
President Grant turned some reservations over to religious groups in an effort to assimilate the Indians to white beliefs. But many Indians were turning to a new native religion that would come to be known as the ghost dance. There would be different versions and different leaders of the movement, but they all had one basic premise. Followers danced to bring about an Indian revival and return the dead to their native lands. Dances could last for days and often induced visions. By 1890, the movement would spread through reservations across the country, but the first prophets reached the Klamath Reservation 2 decades earlier.
But I never knew this is where they danced. I seen this, round circle and stuff, but I never knew this is where they danced. And they said if we gave up all of those European items that we had, the clothes, the tools, everything, go back to our original way and sing those songs right, that the world would turn over and the white people would go back to where they came from, and it would just be Indians here, and all of the Indians that had died would come back to life.
In the stronghold, the Modocs set up a medicine flag, sang their sacred songs, and danced for strength and unity.
When they would dance here and sing, it would freak those soldiers out of, hey, you guys are fighting a battle against the whole United States of America, and you'll stop and dance and sing?
The Modoc shaman, curly-headed doctor, told the Modocs that with his magic, they would be invincible.
He assured the Modocs that no Modoc would be killed in the Modoc War. And he even took a tule rope and put it around the entire perimeter of the stronghold. He painted it red. He said, no soldier will cross that rope, no Modoc will die. They didn't think they could be touched, ever.
The U.S. military set up camp on the edge of the lava flow. Horses were of little use in the rocky terrain. On foot, with few rations or medical supplies, the soldiers prepared to march into the stronghold on Friday, January 17, 1873. Part of the force would take the east, another part the west, gradually compressing the Modocs into surrender. At 4 a.m., a bugle call rallied the soldiers. Just a few miles away, the Modocs heard it too. Then the weather changed. A heavy fog rose up off the lake, engulfing the battlefield. As the soldiers marched toward the stronghold, they found themselves blind and vulnerable in the hostile terrain.
I looked out over the lava beds. A fog hung over it, so dense that nothing was visible. To see the column go half down and then disappear from view suggested the words of Dante's Inferno, "All hope abandon, ye who enter here." Lieutenant Colonel David Perry.
Soldiers were yelling and hollering at other soldiers, trying to keep in line. Some of the soldiers shot at shadows. It might have been a bush or a tree. It might have been one of their own guys.
The military inched forward. When one unit came to a large rocky trench, the men simply stopped.
They couldn't force them soldiers to come across there. That's where they would have been stopped. That's where they would have been hunkered back behind those hills, and their commanding officers would have been calling them yellow-bellied beef eaters, trying to make them go, and they wouldn't go. They wouldn't budge.
It's important to realize the ruggedness of this terrain where this war was fought. If you look out there, I mean, look at the rocks. The military had never experienced anything like this. They completely fell apart. Their gloves were shredded, even their shoes.
While the soldiers tried to spread out in a skirmish line, the Modocs used the land as their ally, hiding behind rocks and moving through natural trenches unseen, attacking the soldiers like ghosts.
I have been 23 years in service. I have never before encountered an enemy, civilized or savage, occupying a position of such great natural strength, exposing nothing but a puff of smoke, and picking off our most advanced skirmishers with deadly aim. Lieutenant Colonel Frank Wheaton.
By the end of the day, at least 9 soldiers were dead on the field. 12 more would die of their wounds, and dozens would carry scars for life. The Modocs lost no warriors. In fact, they were now well armed, having stripped the dead of their weapons and ammunition. The military retreated and regrouped.
In the opinion of many experienced officers, regulars, or volunteers, 1,000 men would be required to dislodge them from their almost impregnable position. Lieutenant Colonel Frank Wheaton, 1873.
Telegraph offices in nearby towns transmitted the story to the outside world. Newspaper reporters arrived on scene, making camp with the military and local ranchers. Reporters wrote dispatches from the field. It would be the first Indian War covered by multiple reporters.
When you look at the images in the newspapers over time, the early images are very stereotypical. I mean, they're completely fabricated images of bloodthirsty Indians that have very little bearing on reality.
Eventually, that changed. 2 photographers, Lewis Heller and Edward Muybridge, hauled their bulky cameras to the scene. Muybridge was commissioned by the U.S. government to photograph the Modoc War. Many of the photos were staged. This Warm Springs Indian scout was labeled as a Modoc warrior. Still, the images were a more realistic depiction than people were used to seeing. The photos were the basis for woodcut engravings published in newspapers from New York to London. Readers were enthralled, and to some, Captain Jack became a folk hero.
Each mail brings to camp an extensive correspondence for Captain Jack. One wishes Jack to come there and scalp the fellow who wants to win his girl away from him. The New York Times, 1873.
One reporter ventured alone into the stronghold and was rewarded with an interview with Captain Jack.
It's covered on the front page of the New York Herald. During that interview is the first time they tell the story of Ben Wright. There was actually quite a bit of sympathy, especially from East Coast papers.
Pressured from groups sympathetic to the Indian cause, President Grant decided to negotiate. Peace commissioners were appointed to craft a solution. Former Indian agent Alfred Meacham was one of the commissioners. Meacham knew the Modocs and had successfully negotiated with Captain Jack in the past. His first goal was to set up a line of communication.
Meacham was certainly infinitely more fair-minded than the white settlers along the Lost River. He was probably more fair-minded than the military who came in.
I think his heart was really with the Indian people, the native people of the state of Oregon.
Meacham used interpreters in his negotiations.
There was One-Eyed Dixie, There's Artenia Chokes, Matilda Weddell. They all played an important role with liaison between the U.S. Army and the Modoc tribes. They were important ladies.
But Toby Riddle and her white husband Frank were Meacham's favorites. Toby was a Modoc woman and Captain Jack's cousin. He trusted her. For weeks, she translated as the two sides tried to reach an agreement. Jack wanted amnesty for Hooker Jim's band that had killed the settlers, and he wanted a reservation on Modoc land.
When Jack and them were negotiating, he says, give me this 6 mile square of rocks. I can make a living there. And he said, no white man can.
Estimates valued the land at $20,000. The war would cost almost $500,000. The most expensive Indian war in history, considering the number of people involved. But the government would yield nothing. Negotiations ground to a halt. The military made camp and waited, fighting mosquitoes and boredom. As winter turned to spring, profiteers in nearby towns gouged the army for supplies. Indians came and went from the lava fields, sometimes even wandering into the military camp for news.
There was a period of time where the Modocs just came and went at will. They would go up on the Klamath Reservation to visit friends. It was very loose during that strange time between battles. Here's two different groups of people, military soldiers and Modocs fighting against each other, but they did kind of know each other. So there was a lot of irony like that in the Modoc War.
As the Peace Commission tried negotiations, the military moved its troops closer to the stronghold, sending the message that the deadlock would end one way or another. Then some soldiers captured a herd of Modoc horses. Captain Jack sent his wife Lizzie, his sister Mary, and Scarface Charlie to retrieve them. But the military refused to give them back.
The soldiers placed their bayonets against the backs of the women and pushed them outside the corral. Next to her child, the Indian woman loves her horse. Here was the beginning of the awful ending of the Peace Commission. Alfred Meacham.
Back at the stronghold, the Modocs argued over what to do next. Captain Jack spoke for peace. But once again, Hooker Jim and his band wanted blood and goaded Jack into joining them.
At some point, one of the Modocs jumped up on a rock next to him and put a woman's shawl around his shoulders at an Indian Modoc woman's basket on his head and called him a fish-hearted woman.
Jack and Sconch and John, as leaders, they had to do what their people told them to do, not what they were telling the people to do. It's a different type of a leadership, a different type of culture.
And so it was when the Modocs voted, they voted against peace and to eliminate the peace commissioners.
Brigadier General Edward R.S. Canby commanded the Army's Department of the Columbia, including Washington, Oregon, and Northern California. A veteran of the Civil War with a long military career, he had dealt with Indian tribes before. Now, he would join the Peace Commissioners in a meeting with the Modocs set for April 11, 1873, Good Friday. But Modoc interpreter Toby Riddle learned the Indians planned to attack the meeting if the commissioners would not give in to the Modoc demands.
She went to the commissioners and she warned them. She said, hey, you guys, don't do this. The Modocs will get you. Canby would not listen. Alfred Meacham knew better. Alfred Meacham knew Toby Riddle well, and he knew that their lives were endangered.
But Meacham was powerless to stop the meeting. Instead, he secretly packed a gun and wrote a final letter to his wife.
My dear wife, you may be a widow tonight, but you shall not be a coward's wife. Alfred Meacham, April 11th, 1873.
Toby and her husband reluctantly agreed to act as interpreters.
And there was a white flag of peace. And the Modocs thought back to 1852 and the white flag of Ben Wright, and it didn't have a lot of meaning to them. And I think in the back of their minds, they felt if they eliminated the leaders, it would end the war.
But of course, it doesn't reckon with a military force that actually stretches all the way back to Washington, D.C. with its tremendous resources.
The morning was clear and bright. Soldiers climbed a nearby bluff to watch the Peace Commission meeting about a mile away from the camp. There, a tent was set up, and Canby handed out cigars. Toby and Frank Riddle translated. The two sides talked for less than an hour. Jack again asked for his own reservation. Again, Canby said he could promise nothing. Then Jack sealed his fate. He gave the signal, saying in Modoc, "All ready."
Jack pulled out a pistol and aimed it at Canby and fired. The gun misfired. Why Canby didn't get up and run, we do not know, but he didn't. The gun was recog. And this time it hit him right below the left eye.
The other Modocs pulled out guns, killing another commissioner. Frank Riddle and another man ran for cover. Sconchin John shot at Alfred Meacham. A bullet tore through Meacham's face, another through his arm. 4 shots ripped through his body. Then a Modoc tried to scalp him, but Toby Riddle intervened.
She yelled out to the Modocs, "The soldiers are coming, the soldiers are coming." And the Modocs, ran in every which direction. Of course they weren't coming. Alfred Meacham was her friend, and she knew that he was gravely wounded, and she wanted to save him.
She cradled the injured Meacham in her lap, while nearby General Canby lay dead and stripped of his clothes. At the same time, 2 Modocs waving a white flag ventured near a camp outpost. First Lieutenant William Sherwood went out to meet them. The Modocs fired, mortally wounding him. They escaped into the safety of the lava beds before troops could arrive. Sherwood died 3 days later and was buried in the camp cemetery. General Canby's remains traveled from Wairika to Portland, then to San Francisco, and finally to Indianapolis for burial. All along this route, thousands paid their respects to the fallen general.
Canby had been killed. The only general ever killed in an Indian battle. Custer was not a full general at the time of his death. And so it was that the die was cast. There was no going back now.
The death of the general, that was really huge and was really kind of a moment of national trauma, I think, for many Americans.
The killing of General Canby was treated very harshly in the Oregon press. Whatever good press the Modoc had gathered prior to that certainly turned full force the other way.
Public opinion is almost unanimous against the peace policy, owing to these recent occurrences, and the majority believe in exterminating the outlaws. The New York Times, 1873.
This is the iconic drawing of the attack that's transmitted to London and to European readers, and it really crystallizes this idea of betrayal. Jack stands there staring down Canby with his gun outstretched, and Canby stands there coolly staring him down with his hand upright, as if he could will the bullets to stop.
The commanding general of the U.S. Army, William T. Sherman, raged for action. Sherman was famous for his scorched earth policy in the Civil War. He brought that same philosophy to Indian affairs. He ordered the military to crush the Modocs.
Treachery is inherent in the Indian character. No mercy whatever should be shown toward the Modocs. You will be fully justified in their utter extermination. General William T. Sherman, 1873.
The local papers called for volunteers, and reinforcements poured in from around the West Coast. until there were nearly 1,000 men, both soldiers and civilians. The night of April 14, 1873, the second battle for the stronghold began. Mortar fire pounded the stronghold day and night. One Modoc died when he picked up a cannon shell, and the soldiers crossed the red tule rope. Then the military cut off the Modoc water supply. Jack took decisive action, sending less than a dozen unmarried men out to the battlefield against the U.S. Army. They would light fires, run and shoot, and hold the line all night, creating the illusion of many warriors and buying the Modocs time. That night, men, women, and children silently walked out of the stronghold.
I think of all the things that happened in the Modoc War, this was the one that absolutely stunned military officers in charge, because they assumed the Modocs were surrounded. But they had found a path that led from the stronghold right straight down through the lava beds, and they just literally walked out.
The troops took possession of the lava beds, the stronghold, but the Indians were gone. Colonel William Thompson.
For 5 months, this had been the Modocs' fortress. Now it was abandoned. According to reports, soldiers scalped an elderly man and shot an elderly woman left behind. The stronghold was empty, but the lava fields stretched on for miles. Within days, a patrol of about 65 soldiers set out to scout the landscape. At noon on April 26th, the soldiers stopped for lunch, took off their boots, and were ambushed by Modoc warriors led by Scarface Charlie. In the rugged terrain, they were helpless. In less than an hour, the Modocs slaughtered every officer and many of the patrol. For the U.S. military, it was the worst battle of the Modoc War. The carnage only stopped when Charlie decided he'd had enough. Survivors reportedly heard him call out to them in English.
All you fellas that ain't dead better go on home. We don't want to kill you all in one day.
22 soldiers were dead, 16 wounded. The Army called in Donald McKay to track the Modocs. His father was a white trapper and his mother a Cayuse Indian. He spoke several languages and was famed as a scout. He led a band of Warm Springs Indians and military men into the lava fields to find and fight the Modocs. In battle, they killed a popular Modoc warrior and sent Captain Jack's group running.
Understand that when the Modocs left the stronghold, they were in desperate need of water, which they got from the ice caves. They needed food, they were malnourished, and of course, they had children and women with them. Psychologically, the Modocs were becoming a very shattered people. It was at that time that the dissension with the Modocs began to happen.
Hooker Jim's band and some of the men who killed the settlers and forced Captain Jack to kill Canby now turned themselves into the Army and offered to track down Captain Jack. In exchange, they were given amnesty.
These people had families that they were trying to protect, and that there were much more complicated things going on than mere issues of loyalty.
I can understand people saying, "Hey, I've had enough of this. You know, let's go." And I think just the conditions alone would cause that.
Eventually, other Modocs were captured or turned themselves in. And finally, starving and exhausted, on June 1st, 1873, Captain Jack laid down his gun one last time. He had held off the Army for more than 7 months.
And that's the misconception a lot of people have, Jack being captured. He never was captured. He surrendered on his own. And when they asked him why he's surrendering, Jack told them, my legs gave out.
The war was over. The killing was not. A volunteer militia group killed 4 Modoc prisoners of war.
The women and children were still in the wagon with their dead. It was the most ghastly sight. The blood from the dead Indians had run through the wagon bed and made a broad red streak for 20 yards down the road. Colonel William Thompson.
In Fort Klamath, Captain Jack and 5 others were tried in a military commission without representation as war criminals. Toby and Frank Riddle, acting as interpreters, were paid $10 a day. Hooker Jim and members of his band testified for the prosecution.
I think it would be fair to say that today we would call the trial a charade.
The jury was made up of the officers, the very men that they had fought against. At one point, 2 of the Modocs simply slumped to the floor and slept through it.
Jack in the trial constantly testifies that it wasn't, I didn't want to do it, it was the younger men. The younger men are the ones who wanted to keep on fighting. I wanted peace. All I wanted was peace. I mean, at one point during the trial, he even yells out, you know, Hooker Jim, why'd you kill my friends? I didn't want you to kill my friends. A reference to the 14 settlers that were killed on Lost River.
Captain Jack spoke only through interpreters. Even today, accounts of what he said differ. In shackles, he spoke. He told the court he had always wanted peace. And in one account, he told the story of the Ben Wright killings. But it made no difference. The court found 6 men guilty of murder in violation of the laws of war.
But the Modoc never agreed to these laws of war, you know? And in their mind, the laws of war had already been broken.
Nationwide, some humanitarians called for clemency. President Grant listened and commuted the sentences of 2 men. They were sent to Alcatraz. Captain Jack, Black Jim, Boston Charlie, and Sconchin John were sentenced to die at the end of a rope. But in a small cell at Fort Klamath, they would languish in chains for months. Pictures of Modoc prisoners were sold as souvenirs. Tourists made visits to the fort, and newspaper reporters interviewed the condemned men.
Jack was allowed to visit his 2 wives and his daughter Rosie. Jack adored Rosie, and people who witnessed his last meeting with his wives and with Rosie talked about how he held Rosie and rocked her over and over and over again because he knew, of course, he was going to the gallows.
On October 3rd, 1873, the men were to be executed. People traveled from all around to watch.
The execution is to be as public as possible so that they may be forever terrified by the spectacle. The Klamaths, whose reservation is situated 4 miles south, are coming to witness the tragedy. San Francisco Chronicle, October 2nd, 1873.
When they took those 4 Modocs and put them in the scaffolds at Fort Klamath, they made the Klamath people and they made the Modoc people stand and watch as they hung them. Now my great-grandfather Peter and his brothers and sisters and his mother had to stand there and watch his father being hung. I don't know what that felt like, but it really bothers me every time I think about it.
Today, Fort Klamath is a museum, and grave markers still stand with the names of the condemned. But there is no conclusive documentation as to what actually happened to the bodies. It is known that after the hanging, the men were decapitated. Their heads were sent to the Army Medical Museum in Washington, D.C., a common practice at the time. 2,000 American Indian skulls would eventually end up there for study. The Modocs that had participated in the war were rounded up in exile. 155 men, women, and children were sent by wagon to Wairika, then by railroad cattle cars to Kansas, and finally to Oklahoma. It was a long, cold journey. At least 2 prisoners died along the way. Within the next decade, nearly half were dead from disease and malnutrition, including Captain Jack's daughter, Rosie.
They talk about them dying of disease and that type of stuff, and I don't believe that. I think they died of heartbreak.
Old Scotians followers who did not participate in the war remained in Oregon on the Klamath Reservation. Captain Jack's band and others who fought with him would live at the Quapaw Agency in Oklahoma and begin a new life.
Now, they'd only been there a couple years when, lo and behold, who shows up at the Modoc Quapaw Agency than Alfred Meacham? And how does he find these bloodthirsty savages, as the papers often called them? They were playing croquet.
Meacham is a committed friend of the Indians. He's a committed humanitarian, and he wants to kind of spread the news of a more humanitarian way of treating Indians.
Meacham put together an Indian lecture tour, traveling through the East Coast, featuring some of the Modocs that had tried to kill him.
That's the way he would start his lectures. He'd say, "You see the scar? Let me tell you how I got this scar." And then, of course, the very men that had done it, were there.
But this was not a Wild West show. Meacham wanted Eastern audiences to know the Indian plight.
The chapter in our national history which tells our dealings with the Indian tribes will be one of the darkest and most disgraceful in our annals. Alfred Meacham, 1873.
Toby Riddle and her family joined the traveling group, and Meacham named her Wainema, the woman chief. She would keep that name for the rest of her life. By special act of Congress, she was granted a $25 monthly lifelong pension for services rendered during the Modoc War.
What happened in the Klamath Basin is merely a microcosm of what went on in lots of other places.
Over the next 2 decades, Lieutenant Colonel George Custer would make his last stand against the Sioux Indians at Little Bighorn. The Nez Perce would make their long, doomed march toward freedom. And finally, the Lakotas would be massacred at Wounded Knee. President Grant's so-called peace policy would result in some of the nation's bloodiest battles between the U.S. military and American Indians. Today, the Oregon Modocs are part of the Klamath tribes, which encompasses the Klamath, Modoc, and Yahuskan Paiute people. Modoc elder Albert Lawver is a tribal council member.
That's right here. My grandfather. Yeah, that's when they first got him out of their native clothing, got this white man clothing on him. When they made him civilized, this was his sideshow outfit. They put him in that Wild West show. My grandfather was, Huggagosh was his Indian name, Yellowhammer, and his given name was Ben Lawver. He was the warrior in the Modoc War. He was 18 years old when they captured him.
Yellowhammer would be named the last historic chief of the Oklahoma Modocs.
To me, he was a hero, as far as I'm concerned.
In 1909, they were allowed to return to the Klamath Reservation near their traditional lands. A few stayed in Oklahoma. Others returned to Oregon, where their descendants still live today.
It's been home for time immemorial, and it'll be home for time immemorial.
My great-grandfather, Shacknasty Jim, and his wife, Anna, when Anna was pregnant, that little baby she had here in the stronghold, he lived. He was on the Exile back to Oklahoma. He grew to manhood. He had my father, and I'm here today.
I always just learned when we were younger, if you fell off and got hurt, or if you need courage, well, you better Modoc up. And that meant you don't be afraid of anything, because our people went through so much for you to be here. It's a song that's supposed to be shared. We're not supposed to keep it to ourselves. But it just means now that we've met, we've changed.
There's more about the Modoc War on Oregon Experience online. To learn more or to order a DVD of the show, please visit opb.org. Funding for Oregon Experience is provided by the James F. and Marion L. Miller Foundation, the Oregon Cultural Trust, and viewers like you. Thank you.